So my bio, I now am our Gen AI reporter too. So in addition to some of those fun payment topics, thanks for being here, everybody. This will be a really fun panel. I'm told that it was a lot of keynotes, so now we get a more interactive discussion. Very exciting. I was gonna have the panelists introduce themselves because I won't do them justice, but maybe we could just go in a line and everybody could give sort of their quick, bio and why they're here. But Aleksander, you want to start us off?
Sure. So I'm Aleksander Madry, and I wear two hats. My one hat is I'm a faculty at MIT working on AI. My second hat is to be a little-known company called OpenAI.
I lead the lab Cohere for AI, and so we work on frontier research. And maybe I'll pass over here.
Yep, my name is Kush Varshney. I'm an IBM fellow at IBM Research, and I lead our human-centered and trustworthy AI theme.
And I'm Rishi Bommasani, and I work on industrial policy at Stanford.
Terrific. Well, thank you, guys. We were talking backstage a little bit. I want to start with sort of the ChatGPT moment, and obviously you guys have been steeped in research communities for decades in some cases. What was sort of the ChatGPT moment like for you, and what has it meant that AI has become such a buzzy hot topic in the last couple of years here? We'll go down the line again. I like this setup.
Sure. So I think that to me there are like 2 or 3 ChatGPT moments because some of them are more personal. Because actually, up until 2017, I was not working on AI, and only then when I started looking at the progress in computer vision at the time, I said, oh wow, this actually works, and I need to learn more and get into this. Then, of course, there was the actual ChatGPT moment, so I was not at OpenAI at that time. I have many friends there, and they suggested I look at something, and it was like, again, this is one of those things when you see the progress in the field. There was GPT-2, and you said, okay, that's interesting, guys, but not really. Then GPT-3, okay, I see what you are going for this, but this is not that. And then there is this like low-key research preview of ChatGPT. So it was impressive to me there that kind of how much you essentially can get by scaling. Because OpenAI has like a very simple recipe at the time saying, everything, the rules are known, just scale it up. And that was kind of the ChatGPT moment for me. And the recent one, at least personally, was we just released the O1 models, and that's kind of some of the technology that I'm really excited about. And yeah, we will see what happens next.
And so you spent time at Google DeepMind as well. I wonder your perspective and just sort of the fact that it's become so mainstream, for lack of a better word, at this point.
Yeah, I think it's really surreal. So I was just saying, we were chatting, it's very rare that research is immediately impact, and that normally these type of conversations and even this type of conference is very specialized. Like you talk to a lot of people who are building models, and it's very rare that it resonates so immediately with people in different parts of the world and in different parts of society. I would say, the surrealness comes with a sense of a mandate for researchers who build these models and like how we think about the impact of our work. I also think what's been interesting is a shift. We now have this shift from very specialized models to much more general purpose, and now this idea that we actually want the flexibility to cater or personalize these models again to things that are very personal and how people think about how they want to use the model. So I think this is a really interesting paradigm shift that's happened very rapidly over the last few years. But maybe I'd love to open it up.
Yeah, I mean, for me too, it was something I wasn't expecting. I mean, I was excited to see this thing come out at that point. I thought maybe it will be a few more years later down the road and maybe even not as good. And I think 2 things. I mean, one personal experience, I actually had jury duty a few weeks afterwards, and like with these 11 other like normal people, right? I mean, just seeing them talk about this, and they were like excited about it, and I mean that was very eye-opening for me. And then just on the IBM side, I mean, it just changed the way we work. I think, especially what Sara just said, kind of pushed back the product and the research altogether, and kind of made us on the research division kind of part of this product roadmap, which was unusual for us.
Yeah, maybe I'll just go back to when ChatGPT came out. I remember I was at NeurIPS in 2022, and I I remember, one of the first things I found kind of very striking about it was that you could use ChatGPT to simulate a VM. And I remember this was a thing people were thinking about back in 2022. It was like one of the first things that went up on Twitter. And it was just very striking to me because on one hand, technically there was a bunch that was interesting happening. And then, I remember sort of later that week being in an Uber in New Orleans, and the Uber driver asked me this bizarre question at the time, which now seems like a very legitimate question, which is like, should my daughter be using ChatGPT in her class? And I remember in 2022 thinking like, what a perplexing question. But now, especially being at a university, we're seeing that this technology definitely affects how we do education. And so that's been also interesting to see in particular.
That's really interesting. Well, while we're talking about universities and Stanford, talk a little bit about your work and what you're doing for responsible AI. We should also say that's sort of the overarching theme of the panel we'll talk about a lot. But how are you ensuring that everything's built safely here? And then what's the role of academia?
Yeah, I think the role of academia is definitely changing and is a bit different from maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where I think academia and industry more so in concert were sort of driving forward the technological frontier of where machine learning and AI is. I think academia still has a very important role to play there, but I think we're very much trying to figure out what that is, especially when things are much more capital intensive. In parallel, I think a lot of the work we have been doing has been trying to understand what are other ways in which academia can also lead to the sort of responsible development of this technology. And so some of the work we've looked at is, for example, can academia sort of try to encourage industry to be more transparent in how this technology is being built? And so one of the things we run is this sort of transparency index where we score many of the different major companies for how transparent they are. And so this is maybe also another change, especially from how computer science works in academia, of trying to think about how computer science can sort of affect industrial policy as it's being built in this domain.
Who's the most transparent?
It's an evolving topic, so I'll wait until the next set of rankings come out. But yeah, we'll see how that changes.
And Aleksander, do you have thoughts on this too? I mean, with your background at MIT, you're sort of in this dual role. What about academia from your perspective? You could follow up on Rishi's point.
Yeah, so actually, it's rare in academia, but I actually agree with Rishi quite a bit on what he said. So I do very strongly believe that academia has a huge role to play in AI, but yeah, we need to figure out what it is. Because one thing that is not working well is academia trying to compete with this leading company on the research, on the capabilities of these models. Of course, there will be some very interesting ideas out of there, but unfortunately, given the scale, you will not know if you are getting the right signal or if this is just something that is a fluctuation. So that might be not maybe the most impactful way academia can kind of impact things, but yes, the way it needs to actually, not only can, but needs to the role to play, is to think about the responsibility aspects, about impact, or about policy, about what does technology mean to us as a society, right? Again, OpenAI thinks about this, other companies also think about this, but really this is such a complex and also multifaceted question that this is what academia is about. It's about having difference of opinions, thinking deeper, thinking on a longer horizon, and that's what I hope the academia can do right now. I think it should do it even more. So looking forward to that.
Do you guys have thoughts on academia? And we can move on. I do want to talk about.
I mean, maybe I'll be a bit cheeky just to kick this off, but I think that it's hard to say that academia should be relegated to evaluations. I think this is tricky because I don't think you're saying that, but it sometimes ends up being implied in how academia has this compute gap and lack of access to resources. I think that there has to be more notion of how you bridge some of those gaps, and I think, Rishi, this is part of what you advocate for in the Transparency Index, and we won't talk about who ranks where, but I think this is really interesting. There is a compute gap, though, so I think where academia has a really important role is thinking about efficiency and also really techniques for data distillation and also specialization. I do think these are very promising areas. There has to be more of a conversation, though, at a national level about compute strategy. So, you know, I lead an industry lab. We have access to significant amounts of compute. We also provide compute grants for researchers. It's a Band-Aid, and I think that, you know, OpenAI does the same. They provide compute grants, but there needs to be more of a national conversation about what access looks like. And we all know that compute is not created equal, right? So hardware matters, access matters, software layer matters. Traditionally, national compute infrastructures are frankly not compatible with machine learning workloads and often have very poor request kind of processes. So they end up idle for a lot of the time. So this all needs to be addressed kind of head on, and this is a national conversation.
Any closing thoughts? We'll move on to regulation as well.
No, I think just the fact that there's always going to be, I mean, creativity needed in evaluation for LLMs because there's so many different behaviors that they exhibit, and we're the most creative people, I think, in academia, certainly. And so I think the broader set of views, the broader set of eyes that we get is actually a good thing. So.
We'll talk about, speaking of responsible AI, I think there's this big question of how do you regulate this space without dampening innovation. There's a California bill that's awaiting Gavin Newsom's signature. Do you guys have thoughts on who should regulate this? Should it be a state level thing? And then in terms of SB 1047, I don't know if you think that's a good thing. Aleksander, maybe we'll start with you on this.
Sure. First of all, I'm not speaking on behalf of OpenAI, just the standard thing. So I think OpenAI made her opinions about the California bill open and public. So first, regulation. Should we regulate? The answer is yes. Like, there is absolutely no question to me that this is too important of a technology with too much of an impact, and honestly too much of an opportunity for an abuse that we can go get away without regulation. Of course, now the question is how to regulate, and I think that's where really where the devil is hidden. So first of all, I do think that what is very important and still missing is making sure there is a parity of understanding of the technology on both sides. Because currently there's a little bit of, again, this is not uniformly true, but it's still a little bit lopsided, where there's kind of this argument, oh, only these big companies know this technology, so only then they can really draft the regulation, which I don't think is the right way to think about this. So I think the first step, and this is actually happening, there are these AI safety institutes starting, which really they should become partners with the industry to think through what are the undesirable impacts of technology, how do we measure them, and what are the right mitigation strategies. For now, this should be really a partnership where we just learn from each other, in particular OpenAI, but also Anthropic in particular, have partnership where they can look at our models before deployment. And again, we are really sharing a bit more with them just to develop this understanding. But of course, now once you have the understanding, we should move to actual binding regulations. And this is where this expertise that is not coming from the companies, but is coming from the government can direct them. I do think they should happen at the federal level. I just cannot imagine that the patchwork of legislation where every state has something different. It just sounds like quite a mess. But yeah, there are certain problems in our government that the way they work. So I will leave it at here, but I'm happy to kind of follow up.
And then also on a global level too. Sara, I wonder your thoughts on the California bill in particular, but there's state, there's federal, there's global. So how do you square all of that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just pick on two things that you're saying. I tend to agree that this particular bill, my perspective is coming from a scientific perspective. I just think it has some bad science in it. It kind of equates certain measures of scale with risk, and I think that we need better understanding of what are markers of risk. I also very much agree with your statement about safety institutes, and I'll say why. I think traditionally government has really struggled to recruit highly technical people, particularly Western governments, and I see this particular moment as something quite special where safety institutes are getting the resources needed to attract talented people into government. And so I actually think this is one of the most promising opportunities for really moving responsible AI from something that's a panel name to something that is accountable and where governments can have a nuanced perspective on what's the best way to serve. So we're also partnering with safety institutes. And this helps inform, there's two main obstacles. One is how do you estimate risk? And also, how do you do it in a way in which you can measure on an ongoing basis that's flexible enough, that captures your underlying risk profile, but also isn't gameable? And this is a very big challenge. And I really worry that the metrics in this bill are incredibly gameable. Because we know that there's techniques which make small specialized models incredibly risky, but aren't captured by some of the notions of this. So yeah, I'll open up. But the one comment about global is everyone wants to do their own framework. So I share, it's kind of an extension of your comment about the state versus the federal. I find it very promising that safety institutes are now starting to collaborate together because again, it means technical resources are being shared, and it leads to much more precision in what the kind of guidelines. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just building on the precision point, I mean, one thing that we've been thinking a lot about is just the precision should be also on the use of the technology, and the regulation may be on the uses rather than on the basic technology itself, because just like any other sort of thing, you use a wheel on a car versus a wheel in a windmill versus a wheel in something else. You don't regulate the wheel itself, but the use of it in other sort of things. And when we use AI in all sorts of different sort of settings, we already have laws, we already have regulatory agencies and bodies that are supposed to, do what they're supposed to do, right? And so, yes, there are some new things coming with AI, but there's so many things that have been around for 40, 50, 100 years that we still need to keep up with. So.
And Rishi, maybe you want to close us off on this topic, and we'll.
Yeah, and again, in my personal capacity, not what Stanford thinks, but on SB 1047, I think I'd echo what Aleksander and Sara and others have mentioned, that I think it has many challenges, and I think there is a sort of general question here of what jurisdictional level do we want things to operate at? I think I share Aleksander's point that sort of, at least theoretically, it would be great to do things at the federal level. I think it's also great to see, as the news came out this morning, all of these different AI safety institutes coming together, and they'll be convening in November. And so I think we're building this infrastructure and these institutions that I think are important for driving this work. And I think I am optimistic for what Sara is hinting at, that it'll change the amount of sort of technical expertise we have in government, because I think the statistic from this year's AI index says that about 0.7% of AI PhDs enter government currently. And I think, if we think the government is going to properly govern and regulate this technology, they need expertise. And so I think that is going to need to change, and hopefully this can be a catalyst towards that.
We can maybe stay on the transparency topic too. I guess sort of go back to that as well. I think of this in some building and developing some of these models and having transparency, but also probably maintaining a competitive edge, being a private company. And in the case of OpenAI, Anthropic, others who, there's probably things that they don't want out there for competitive reasons. What advice would you give to companies that want to build in a transparent way, that need to be regulated, but also want to keep their edge? I wonder how you think about that, Rishi.
Yeah, I think there's a key conceptual insight here, which is that if we're really interested in what's sort of competitively relevant for a company, it's effectively what they know that their competitors don't know, right? And so that's the margin you're thinking about. But in contrast, the margin we might be interested in for sort of the public or for government is just the gap between what the public doesn't know and what the companies do know, right? And if you imagine that the public is considerably less knowledgeable than their immediate competitors, there might be some sort of free lunch there, in the sense of things that we can disclose to increase transparency without any sort of trade-off against competitive interest. And so a lot of my work is trying to understand that, sort of what I would think of as the easy part of what we can be transparent about without really having to tackle this trade-off. But I think, as you said, socially, ultimately, we do need to also think about these harder questions where there may be a trade-off. So for example, the EU in their work on trying to increase transparency has looked at data under the AI Act. And this is, of course, a very critical topic for competition because a lot of, and I think a lot of folks here have even better insight than I do. Data is sort of very critical and sort of secret sauce of building all of these models. And so figuring out where that trade-off should be struck between greater transparency because it's sort of implicated to a number of relevant live sort of conversations today about copyright or privacy or bias or whatever, and competitive interest is, I think, one thing the EU especially has to think about right now.
Kush, maybe we'll get your take on this as well.
Yeah, so I mean, as Rishi knows in gory detail, I mean, when we've been building our Granite models, we've been releasing a lot of the data set information in our technical reports and everything like that. So, I mean, why do we do that, right? I mean, it's to show up highly on his list, maybe, I don't know, but really it's because when we are working with customers, right? I mean, why would a customer want to use your model if they don't know what's in it, if they can't really trust it and these sort of things? So whenever we get to, I mean, any high consequence application of AI where these foundation models are going to be used, then really this is almost should be a given in a way, because without that level of transparency, like you don't feel confident, you don't feel trusting of this thing. So I think that's kind of almost a basic requirement.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe we'll go down the line on this one and then we'll switch topics.
I think it's a bit more complicated. I mean, I'll say this. So we've released massive data sets, particularly in multilingual, where we did, and I've been involved in several efforts that are really anchored in data provenance. So the Data Provenance Initiative, which we've released several papers, is about what is the state of how we trace lineage of our data sets. It's very complicated. So for example, we did an exhaustive audit of data sets and where they're stored, and often they're misrepresented. The licenses are re-uploaded and miscategorized. So even if you want to do the right thing, it's very hard. When we released the IA data set, which is the largest multilingual fine-tuning data set to date with 513 million instances, we did extensive provenance lineage. I'll say there's two things going on. Right now, the fact that there isn't consensus on the law that is applied to data actually means that the labs which do the right thing, I'm not speaking about our lab, but labs that I know have tried to do the right thing have been penalized heavily for releasing large data sets, both of images and also of text. And that means that and these are very much academic labs, and so there's very interesting tensions there. So there needs to be more clarity from really what governance structures about what is the state of data. The second thing I would say is it is legitimate for businesses to have reasons after they spend a lot of data on annotation, which they've created, to not release it. That's just the state of the world. And I will say, I think that there has to be a balance in between. So the reason why we spent so much work persevering through this kind of ambiguity to release the multilingual data set is that we felt so strongly that it wasn't being served by current models or current data sets or current labs. And there's things like that which are very critical to release because it's about also making sure our models serve everyone. And I've seen very important releases of safety data as well, where labs have done the right thing. But if we are serious about this attempt, which I think, Kush, you're optimistic about, that data has to be released, there has to be way more understanding of clarity over what we can do. And also, there has to be more tools for flagging incorrect provenance. There should be tools on Hugging Face for sending an alert when something is miscategorized. This is the truth, this is the reality. And that way, with better lineage, people would be more willing to share data.
Does that mean updating copyright law, for example? That's something we deal with in media a lot, but where do you think that goes?
I think that guidance on copyright law would actually be very welcome to many people. I think the ambiguity is very difficult, actually, for people who are trying to do the right thing. And I also think the advantage we have is that most data is shared in 3 places, right? It's GitHub, Papers with Code, Hugging Face. So there is a real opportunity if we form good protocols of how we want to responsibly share data that we would adhere to it. But that requires different tools and it requires ways to make sure we're being consistent.
Aleksander, maybe your closing thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I just want to very quickly say that I think we need transparency, but we have to remember that transparency is, like, the question is transparency on what and to whom, right? So, for instance, I think there are 2 major aspects of transparency. One of them is about the capabilities and also, like, where we are, like the situation awareness kind of situation, and where we expect to be. And again, yes, this touches on a lot of IP, but I think, like, for instance, the governments should be kept up to date roughly what's happening, where are we, and where we are going. And the public, to some extent, should as well. Again, they don't need to know exactly what is the exact algorithm behind O1, but, like, yeah, the O1 is here, like, what do we expect to have in a year from now? Then there is a transparency about what do we do to mitigate the unwanted impacts of the technology, and this should be much more detailed. And I think in both levels, what we tell the government and what we tell the world. And I think that's, of course, touches on the things that are IP, but I think, like, the trade-offs here are just different.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions because this is so interesting. I could sit here for hours, but we're talking about sort of responsible AI. I wonder if we could give some tangible examples of what you think the biggest ethical concerns are. And then one of the questions I did want to ask was about bias as well. Maybe you could sort of answer both. Aleksander, you want to start? And what are your biggest concerns in terms of ethics?
Well, I have many concerns. Like, they start from things like bias and the way in which processing data at this scale and with this kind of, like, to this kind of fine-grained precision, like, what impacts it can have. And of course, I'm worried also about the, like, safety aspects, like, in particularly how this technology in the wrong hands can cause harm. But to be honest, to me, the biggest challenge of responsible AI is actually make it a project that is the whole societal project. It's not just something people like us who think about this, but actually the society. Because yes, there are some things that we all can agree this is bad, we don't want that. But then there are things that are kind of, unclear. Like, should the chatbot is it okay for chatbot to swear? Under what condition? How about some not safe for work content, right? Like, there's a lot of questions that kind of boils down to the question of values and priorities. And it should not be, like, up to us or any of these companies to provide answers, right? This has to be a debate on the societal level, and this is still not happening.
And very subjective, I would think, too. It probably.
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah.
Yes, like, and it has to be also pluralistic.
Right.
That's the other thing, is like there will be many answers, and it's okay to disagree, but well, we need to have a conversation about that.
Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, I think I'll pick up, since I think we are kind of wrapping up, I want to pick up on one theme that you're talking about, which I agree, which is this notion of how do we optimize these models and what decision boundary do we end up with. So I think one very important direction is how do we make models which are more adaptable, so that better reflect maybe multiple objectives. So we have notions that are global notions of harm, right? So CSAM, extreme violence, these are largely agreed upon across societies as something we don't want our models to do. But we also have, especially a lot of our work is on multilingual contexts and building models that serve the world. There's many different notions of what is acceptable in different parts of the world and legal frameworks. And I think this is a perfect example of how we need even our alignment or our objectives during training to be flexible and to reflect this adaptability, because I agree, we're not monolithic. And it's really critical that both on frontier research as well as we develop these models and implement them in infrastructure, that we have more tools to allow for non-monolithic decision boundaries.
Kush, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, everything that's been said is kind of my thinking as well. So one way I've been thinking about it is kind of from a decoloniality sort of lens. There's been, work of decoloniality of knowledge, which starts with openness of artifacts. So the models being open, openness to society, which is what we were just talking about. But then there's a third level of openness, which I don't think has been thought about enough, which is openness to excluded knowledges. So this is the thinking that not everything is a commandment, not everything is written in books. There's other types of ways that we represent and have knowledge from different parts of the world, and how can we actually expand our notion of what is valid and what can come into these language models.
And Rishi, what about you?
Yeah, and there are a number of harms and things we could talk about here, but I wanted to pick out one specifically that I've been thinking about a lot is on, Sara pointed out child sexual abuse material, CSAM, because, we talk about a variety of different risks, some that are more speculative, some that are more near term, and regardless, I think this is one risk where we have concrete evidence of the harm that's happening, and doesn't seem to me that in spite of a number of well-intentioned efforts, that we're making great progress to address it. And so I think, to me, that's an important thing, because the harm is here, and we have the evidence and so on, and so, it's our collective responsibility to figure out how to address it.
I don't think we got through even half of what we wanted to talk about. It flew by, but thank you, everyone. This is fascinating, and we'll leave it there, and thanks to all of you for being here.
Yeah.